All right, so I think I'll go ahead and get started while we're letting folks in. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction here. So my name is Tom Courtwright. I'm the lead researcher at IEMDA, the Association for Electric Mobility and Development in Africa, and we are running the e-mobility week all of this month, and then culminating on the week of the 25th to 29th of October with a set of webinars on all sorts of topics, including innovative business models, electric four-wheelers, and so on. And today we have a really great presentation I'm very excited for by Judith Oigar from UN Habitat. And she'll be talking about policy development for e-mobility across African economies and what that looks like. But before we get started with that, I just want to give a quick thank you to our partners for the e-mobility week, EV Charger, who's deploying a charging network across Nairobi, Untapped, who's involved in vehicle financing, including EV vehicle financing across Uganda, Kenya, and other markets. The Waterfront in Karen, which is where we'll be having our exhibition on the 29th of October. If you're in Nairobi, we'll be very excited to see you there. And of course, the UN Environmental Program, which has been a solid institutional backer of everything we do at IEMDA. So with that said, I'm happy to hand over to Judith to present on e-mobility policy across Africa.
Thank you, Tom. I'm just going to share my screen now.
And let me just add quickly as well, after this presentation, we'll have time for some Q&A. So please drop your questions in the chat or raise your hands afterward. We'd love to have all sorts of interesting discussion around this.
Great. My computer is just being a little bit slow. Okay, great. So Tom, is my screen looking good?
Yes, you're looking good.
Okay, great. Okay, hello everybody. My name is Judith Owiga. I work with UN Habitat in the Urban Mobility Unit, mainly focusing on smart and electric mobility, looking at how different technologies can be used to, address the different mobility challenges. So today I'll be presenting a guide to policy development for e-mobility in African economies, mainly building on the work and the projects that we have been involved in, and just sharing from that, and hopefully there is some value to the different people who are attending as we look at how we can, support and enable e-mobility policies in Africa. So I'll be talking mainly, one of the projects that I will be borrowing heavily from is called Solutions Plus Project. And in this project, we are working with a consortium of different organizations in Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So it's mainly looking at integrated urban electric mobility solutions in the context of the Paris Agreement, the SDGs, and the new urban agenda. So Solution Plus aims to set up a global platform for shared public and commercial e-mobility solutions to kickstart the transition toward low carbon mobility. So we really emphasize on the shared, public, and commercial. Shared because we mainly are focusing on public transport and basically mass transit, if I should just put it in a different way. We're mainly working in 10 cities. That's Kigali, Dar es Salaam, Hanoi, Kathmandu, Pasig, Hamburg, Madrid, Montevideo, Quito, and Nanjing. So here I wanted to just set the stage by really talking about the basis of how we approach mobility at UN Habitat, and it's mainly through the Avoid, Shift, and Improve framework. And when we are looking at how to plan and address current challenges and plan for the future, this is the framework we mainly view it from. So looking at Avoid, which is avoid and reduce the need for motorized travel, mainly looking at urban planning, transport demand management. And when we talk about Shift, this one is mainly focusing on our work on public transport, and we are mainly focusing on shifting to more environmentally friendly modes. So looking at shared transportation and even new mobility services that encourage shared transportation, non-motorized transit, that's mainly walking and cycling. And then we also look at improve. And this one, we are looking at improve energy efficient transport modes. And this is really where the Solutions Plus project fits in on electric mobility, but obviously tapping into the other parts of the framework. One of the things I want to mention is that even as we work on electric mobility, we do understand that there are other forms of low carbon mobility. This project mainly just focus on electrification of different mobility vehicles and mobility services and the value chain around it. So that's what I will be touching on a lot. So when we talk about policies, in the work that we are doing, we're mainly looking at linking the national and the city level. So many countries have a historically grown policy framework on urban mobility, but many times that these national frameworks do not consider particular needs of cities, and some of them fall behind compared to the ambitious plans and that countries have agreed to in the Paris Agreement or in the Sustainable Development Goals. So now, as we approach supporting cities and governments when it comes to developing policies, how do we link the two, like the ambitions that are expressed in the different agreements, together with the needs of the cities and the policy framework of the governments? Cities do need a lot of support from the national government, and we are working on different frameworks that can support this, like looking at the capacities and the financial resources. So mainly looking at how we can support different governments and different cities to make the link between national and city level when discussing about policy. So now when we look at the why are we doing this? The objective is so that at the end of the day, citizens worldwide can benefit from such policies and programs, and really just putting people at the center of the policies that we support different governments as they're developing different policies. So mainly when we're looking at these policies, especially at the national level, we're looking at national urban mobility policies and programs that are overarching frameworks that cities can actually build on. So when working on different policies and the work that we're doing, obviously our main target as the mobility unit in UN Habitat is we are looking at affordable and sustainable transport city systems. This is mainly SDG 11.2. And one of the ways we support national governments and cities is through the National Urban Mobility Policies and Plans and the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plans. So I just wanted to touch on and differentiate on the two. So the National Urban Mobility Policies and Plans are really supportive national frameworks. And then we have the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plans. These ones are mainly at the city level, and it's mainly focused on integrated urban mobility planning at the city level. So that's mainly the difference, but there is obviously a relationship between the two of them whereby they build on each other. So one of the things we need to look at is like, what are some of the challenges in policy development? Especially in the African region, which is the area we're focusing on now. One of the things is the lack of data to make data-driven or evidence-based decision-making, so that you can actually justify the different policies and the direction that is being taken and the strategy that is being taken. Then another thing is a lack of clear unifying strategy, and this one is linked very closely with existing governance structures. So we have different organizations working on different mandates, supposed to be collectively working to address the mobility challenge, but different, you could say, agencies are making decisions differently and affecting each other's, projects. So it's very hard for there to be like a unified direction when it comes to, strategy and even just development and even projects. So there is a great lack of that we have seen. Then we have staff capacity, like do the different personnel in these organizations have the capacity to carry out, the policy development and the work involved around it. Then there's the access to funding and financing. So even once you have developed, first the financing and the funding to carry out the process of policy development, and then the funding and financing to implement the strategies that have been developed. And then there's the access to relevant cases, and especially I would say like in the African context, how do we develop policies that are relevant to our respective contexts? Instead of just doing like copy and paste, what are the relevant cases that we can actually look at and cherry pick what works, what can work in our respective contexts. So there's also a challenge in that. So one of the projects we have been working on is in the Solutions Plus project is really on the national urban mobility plans. We are currently working with 5 countries to support in the development of those plans. So the 5 countries we have Philippines, Nepal, Ecuador, Uruguay, and Tanzania. So now, for some of these countries, there is already work that has started in the development of the national urban mobility plans. That's in Philippines, Ecuador, and Uruguay. And then in Nepal and Tanzania, there is not yet any work that has been carried out on that. So I thought I could showcase one of the NAMPs that is currently being developed. Like the Philippines one the process is already underway, but it would be a good way for us to actually just see the process and the thinking around it. So one of the discussions points is where is the current Philippine NAMP being used in policymaking, planning, and process, so that we can actually see where this NAMP can be used. How was it used, in which plans and projects did it contribute to? So one of the things, the NAMP operationalizes their national transport policy. So like for the country Philippines, they already have an existing national transport policy, which the NAMP is the one that is bringing it to life, you could say that, providing now the national framework for implementation. Another thing is the NAMP has been used by different agencies. So now it provides this unifying guiding framework. So for example, the examples that have been given, that people would generally ask the Department of Transport when they're looking for data, like what are the baselines being used, what are the targets, what is lacking on urban mobility, so that there is that unified direction when it comes to working on different projects around mobility. Then another thing that they have discussed is the current NAMP has paved way for projects and planning. Basically, some of the things that it has assisted is in how to carry out evaluation for different projects. It's given the rise for the development of a data collection toolkit so that it can enable different agencies, it can inform different agencies on what data to collect. And then one of the things that has been noted that data collection may actually be easy, but the difficult part, or the part that needs more thought, is identifying what is the data to collect and how to collect the data. So that is what the NAMP framework in Philippines, that is how it has been currently used. And then another thing is, one of the things like where we're working with the Philippines team on is on integrating e-mobility within the NAMP, like adding an emphasis of electric mobility within the NAMP. And for the country of Philippines, one of the things they're looking at is the public transport shift to electric vehicles. So they do have a couple of policies that support this. So there is a national program on public utility vehicle modernization. It is not clear when this is going to be required, but they're looking at how they can shift public transport to EVs. So I also want to say that within the Solutions Plus project, in the cities that I had mentioned, we do have demonstration projects where we are working with different startups that are developing e-mobility, electric vehicles that are relevant to that particular context. So like you can see on this slide, this is one of the e-jeepneys from Tojo Motors, which is the startup we are working with in Philippines. So just to show that even as we work on policy, it is very much linked to demonstration actions of startups that are on the ground. And then now some of the recommendations from the NAMP process in Philippines. One of the things is to identify the data needs when developing the NAMP process. Identify the data needs, or you will call it the data gaps. Identify or enhance the targets, the different mobility targets. Another thing regarding financials is to identify financial incentives to encourage private sector and operators to shift to e-mobility. Then there is the topic of the just transition, like how to support operators and cooperatives in this transition to electric mobility. I put here in our case, in Kenya, we would call it SACCOs, but in different African countries, there's just how do we support the different operators or collectives of operators, however they have been organized when we are talking about this the transition of public transport to electric vehicles. And then another thing that the NAMP process actually has helped in is identify areas which are neglected in planning. So for example, in the case of Philippines, this has been in freight and transit-oriented development. So now I want to bring it to a case that is closer and more familiar to, I would say, maybe the people on the call, but also even if you're in a different country in Africa, like at least a Kenyan case, an African case. So now we will look at supporting e-mobility policies in Kenya, or policies that support the e-mobility transition. So in Kenya, electric mobility has gained progress as a strategy to mitigate the GHG emissions, improve air quality, decrease fossil fuel dependency, and boost energy security in the context of the increasing worldwide vehicle demand. So what we are seeing is that there are increased motorization rates in Kenya, both for four-wheeler cars and especially for the two-wheelers. So now, electric mobility has gained a strategy when looking at reducing the impact of carbon emissions from the transport sector. And we also have a growing fleet of electric three-wheelers. So like on the slide, the picture that is there is from one of the startups we are working with in Dar es Salaam called AutoTrack, and then they're working on electric three-wheelers. So now if we look at what different counties or at the city level, what is the work that is being done at the city level? So this is an initiative that is being championed by the Nairobi Metropolitan Services. I do know that the organization of Nairobi Metropolitan Services has changed, but I put this inside here just to highlight the proposed Nairobi City Transport Act, which details green. When we're looking at, they're trying to bring more awareness to the benefits of e-mobility. So looking at the creation of green zones where only low emission vehicles are to be allowed. So just looking at some of the policies that are supporting the transition to electric mobility. Then we can also go to another Kenyan city, and this is Kisumu, and just highlighting the Kisumu Sustainable Mobility Plan that was worked on by, together with UN Habitat and ITDP and the Kisumu County government. And, one of the things about Kisumu is that there's a high reliance on non-motorized transport within the city and public transport, but most of the streets in the city are designed for motorized traffic. So some of the components of the Kisumu SAMP include non-motorized transport, looking at non-motorized transport infrastructure, supporting the development of that, introduction of a fast phase of a bike share system. And now when we look at public transport, one of the things they're looking at is modernization of public transport. And I think something that is very important is the Kisumu government is also looking at how to, an eventual transition of the public transport vehicles to electric vehicles, and also investment in the bus rapid transit. So just looking at some of the, once again, city level policies that are supporting the transition to electric mobility. So now looking at a national level, what are the policies that are there to support e-mobility in Kenya? There's the introduction of the 8-year age limit on imported vehicles. The Finance Act in 2018 increased excise duty from 20% to 30% on vehicles whose engine capacity is above 3,000 cc for petrol powered and 2,500 cc for diesel powered. And the purpose was to discourage, basically just to discourage high engine capacity motor vehicles and surcharge their high level of carbon emissions. And then also the Finance Act of 2019 reduced the excise duty on all 100% electric powered vehicles from 20% to 10%. And then another initiative that the government, another thing is that the government has initiated the process of developing a national e-mobility policy for Kenya. So we see that there is some policies that are being put in place to support the transition to e-mobility, which is something that is to be applauded. But even after having said that, I want to also highlight some of the challenges within the sector, which I'm sure very many people in this call are well aware of, be it policymakers or even different innovators in the space. So this is a study that was carried out. It's not been published, but some of the policy gaps that have been identified in Kenya, as you may be aware, there is little legal or regulatory infrastructure around electric two-wheelers. And then, there's the energy regulation around EV batteries is related to solar energy regulations, and there's nothing specific for electric mobility. And then there is a lack of standards, which we have seen that is something in very many African countries, very many developing countries are having those challenges, lack of standards for battery manufacturers, for testing of batteries. Then there's also the classification and identification of EVs, especially when it comes to the process of registration. And then because of this, there's the risk of working with insurance companies, because sometimes the engine number that is there is different from what is on the logbook. And then now looking at on a wider scale, there are lack of incentives for local assembly, lack of regulations to regulate assemblers, lack of regulations for testing and repair. And then now when we go to the customer level, there's lack of debt financing to acquire electric vehicles, because we do know that the capital cost of accessing electric vehicles at the moment is much higher than that of internal combustion engine vehicles. And then other things on a greater scale is lack of supporting infrastructure. Like if we talk about car-free days, bike lanes, docking stations, especially when we look at initiatives to introduce electric bicycles. And then one of the big things is also the taxes, and the taxes that are affecting different SMEs in the electric mobility space. Some of the taxes are lack of incentives for tax-free shipping. The taxes are very high, with some startups saying that they're between 40 to 70% of the cost of the vehicle. As mentioned, lack of taxes, incentives for EV buyers. So those are some of the challenges, policy challenges, when we talk about electric e-mobility space in Kenya. And now I also want to highlight some of the work that we're doing now in Tanzania, which is actually one of the countries, the project countries. Like I mentioned, in Tanzania, we are working on supporting them in developing their national urban mobility policy. But even as we work on that, there are other things. We are also working on supporting them in developing an electric mobility policy, to support the transition of the electric mobility transition. So just building up on on the Philippines case and some of the recommendations, one of the things we are doing is we need to identify the data needs and the gaps, identify and enhance the different mobility targets, look into financial incentives to encourage private sector and operators to shift to electric mobility. We have to consider things around just transition, how to support operators as they and cooperatives in this transition, and then identify areas which may be neglected when it comes to planning. I also want to highlight that for this work that we are currently undertaking, we've actually just started it. We've started with a needs assessment that is being carried out in partnership with IMDA, the ones who are hosting this call. And we're doing it together with UMI, which is the Urban Electric Mobility Initiative, and the Wuppertal Institute. So doing this needs assessment as we work on, developing recommendations for an e-mobility policy and a proposal to begin the work for a national urban mobility plan to encourage, to develop supporting policies for e-mobility in Tanzania. All this we are also doing, working hand in hand with different government actors in Tanzania, especially when it comes to developing policies. This is something that is done. It's a collective project done together with the government because they're the ones who are they're the ones who determine the strategy and they're the ones who determine the implementation. Something else I just wanted to highlight, even as I come to the end of my presentation, after giving you an overview of like the different work we have been doing. One of the needs I had mentioned in my presentation was capacity needs. This for the policymakers and even just for academia and also for entrepreneurs. So one of the needs we have identified is capacity and skills. So we have been organizing different trainings to address different capacity gaps that we have identified in the course of undertaking this project. So next week, actually, we'll be having a training mainly focused on battery solutions for electric 2- and 3-wheelers. The decision to have this training came from feedback from entrepreneurs and different research that we have undertaken, whereby batteries batteries is a challenge, and finding batteries that are relevant and that are efficient in the African context. So we'll be having the first part of the training will be electric 2- and 3-wheeler battery solutions, looking at the different battery solutions, battery management systems, looking at the different standards around them, the gaps, and having discussions around that. Then the second part of our training, which is going to be on 1st to 2nd of November, will be around end-of-life management for electric vehicle batteries, where we'll also have different players from Africa coming to speak and share on their experiences. The training will mainly be done in English, but we'll have interpretation in French because we will have some audience from Francophone Africa. I would encourage you to go to the link at the bottom on the Solutions Plus page, regional training, and register. And I hope we'll be able to see you next week in the training. Thank you very much. I'm just going to end there, and I'm going to hand over to Tom to take over from here.
Thanks, Judith. I really appreciate that. That was very interesting, especially to see some examples all the way from Philippines. I always love seeing that kind of collaboration across the world, not just towards Europe. So at this point, we'll have some questions here. And while questions, please either raise your hands or drop questions in the chat. And in the meantime, Judith, I've got a couple of questions if I can kick this off. So I'm very curious from your view. How can governments prioritize between fiscal policies, such as around taxation, import duties, and so on, and non-fiscal policies, such as having dedicated lanes to EVs? How do you see the breakdown between those types of policies?
That's a very difficult question to ask, because everything is important when you look at fiscal and non-fiscal incentives. I would like to say something, but I feel like one of the very big challenges has really been on, taxation or even financial incentives for startups and even people who want to own electric vehicles in Africa. Has really been, many of the tax regime do not even recognize electric vehicles. There are different arguments around that, because there are very many competing priorities. So I feel like governments can, I don't even have, because I'm thinking non-fiscal incentives are also very important. But I think if we're to look at like the adoption, increasing the adoption of electric mobility within our countries, I think one of the things that would really speed that up is fiscal incentives and tax regimes that could support that transition. So yeah, I would say that they could actually give that some, some attention.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I know it's a tough one to ask to prioritize across these, but I think it's quite interesting. I mean, I would just add a quick example from Tanzania that I think we talked about not too long ago, which is that in Tanzania, as has had happened in other countries as well, for registering vehicles, you have to have the engine size. And so electric vehicles in Tanzania have struggled with this, and a lot of electric two-wheelers are now on the streets of Dar es Salaam without license plates because they're unable to get registered. So I think that really speaks to the importance that you noted there. I see we've got a question from Nico. Let me just turn on your mic. Nico, do you want to unmute yourself and fire away?
Sure. Thanks, Tom. I actually wanted to add to that and would actually disagree with you. It is possible to register electric vehicles in Tanzania. It is possible by the TRA system, and the TRA system is important because the TRA system allows you to get a registration card for the vehicle. The irony in Tanzania is that the TBS, which is the Tanzanian Bureau of Standards, is not really communicating with the TRA, which is the Tanzanian Revenue Authority. So these different bodies have different systems which are not in sync. So now we are actually running into a situation where you actually can register an electric vehicle, but there are no standards which you register them on. That is the irony. But yes, you can register them, right? Sure.
Yeah, so I should have clarified that's more of a problem for the two-wheelers for now, but yeah, they're working on it.
No, it's the same thing. It doesn't matter whether it's a two-wheeler, a three-wheeler, or a four-wheeler. Like legit, you can do that.
Okay, great. That's great. Let me open it up to Joffrey. I saw your hand there. Mutabazi Joffrey, feel free to introduce yourself and ask a question.
Thank you so much, Tom. Judith, great presentation. I think one of the challenges that just an intro. My name is Geoffrey. I run a startup in Uganda that's building electric bicycles for small businesses to deliver goods and services. One of the challenges that any builder, I think, has faced, and why many of us tend to run to China to import, is there is almost no existing supply chain locally for parts, for tools, for all the things that you need to build an EV in Africa. If you look at Germany, for example, a company like Daimler or an OEM like Daimler will have thousands of parts suppliers and machining shops and people doing the seats and all that stuff, but the incentives are a bit more skewed towards adoption, and we are not seeing some incentives that are incentivizing some bit of localization. It doesn't have to be full localization, but it has to be a gradual step, because if done too suddenly, it would be really difficult to at least do it profitably. So I think there's a need for some light incentives on local manufacturing in the policy framework, not too heavy, at least for the simple things. I mean, don't ask people to build lithium-ion batteries here because there is no ecosystem to support that, but at least maybe something for frames, coating of frames, paint shops. I mean, it could be something as basic as some of those things, but I'm sure it does help in some form of localization, and also reduces the import bill. So you don't have to import almost everything from China, but you can have some local, I would say, manufacturing, not full manufacturing, particularly, some bit of it, at least for the start, and then we can sort of find our way onwards from there.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's an often underrepresented area. Judith, did you want to comment on that at all?
Not really. I was going to ask him what are these light incentives, but he went ahead and mentioned it, so that's okay.
Okay, great. Shanta, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Feel free to unmute yourself and tell us about your experience in Zimbabwe.
Sure. Just to say thank you, and it's good to hear. I know East Africa is the hub, but just to say there is a lot happening now in Southern Africa, and there was a Smarter Mobility Conference in South Africa last week in Pretoria. So just to say this is an important part of the world to keep on the radar. And I just wanted to say on the policy front, we worked last year with the Zimbabwean government on the draft EV policy and roadmap. There is a huge challenge around fiscal incentives because in many African countries, I don't think Zimbabwe's alone, there is limited fiscal space in the budget, and it's very hard to get ministries of finance to waiver that. But I think there is appetite around, obviously, local industry development, and I think that's the way to do it. So incentives when you're doing local assembly, CKD, rather than bringing in finished products. So that's a big justification in the industrial side of where do we create jobs in the value chain. I think the big challenge, though, that we faced, and we still face because we need to get the policy adopted, is that we had to deal with 5 different ministries. In Zim, we have the Ministry of Transport doing national roads, but local city roads and rural roads are under local government. Then you have Ministry of Energy, obviously, which is a critical player when we look at the charging infrastructure, Ministry of Industry, Ministry of Finance. So one of the challenges within moving a policy forward is who in government is going to own this policy, and how do you convince these very different ministries that they have a stake in it? And unfortunately, as we know, ministries tend to be siloed, like UN agencies. So it's always a bit of a challenge to get people to work between cross lines. But I think there's a really exciting space. And on the standardization of the batteries, I feel like there's a huge, we need to look at it as an ecosystem, and we need many more academic partnerships. We need to create certified vocational training for battery management, battery wear and tear, so that, yes, we may still be importing from China or India, but we're building a local skill set to manage what's less complicated than a combustible engine, but still requires skills and knowledge, so that we're not, we can manage the lifespan of the battery well. So I'll end there, but I think I've shared the policy, and it was also done. It was done through UNCCT, and it was done. Ghana also has an EV policy that was produced under the same program. So it may be interesting, as I know Kenya moves forward with their policy. In South Africa, unfortunately, the Green Paper was adopted, but there hasn't been much momentum. And I think there's a huge task about reclassifying vehicles. In Zimbabwe, for example, vehicles are classified when they're imported according to weight, which has to do with historical road usage. So we don't even have a breakdown according to emissions. and then we don't have any classification for electric. And that is something I think that the UN could help across the board with governments. I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel in 54 markets. I think we should help just set standards according to having a reliable baseline for measuring carbon, you know, and transport in the future, and give it to everyone and hope they use it. So sorry, that's just a bit of an insight from our experience in Southern Africa.
Cool. Yeah, thank you for that. It's really good to hear things moving in Zimbabwe. Yeah, and I'm excited. I think we'll have you on one of our. You'll be involved as part of the e-mobility week, so we're very excited to hear more from Zim at that time. One question dropped in the chat here by Musiani from Zambia, from the Center for Energy Transitions in Lusaka. He's asking whether UN Habitat has looked at policy frameworks that would govern EV battery manufacturing in the countries that mine the crucial raw materials in Africa.
Thank you for that question. We haven't, or I have not heard of any UN agency, but I don't want to limit my answer to my knowledge. So that is something that I would have to actually do some research on. But I do know that I did see an article. Okay, let me just say that I will do research. I do not want to answer out of ignorance, and I will do more research and possibly give some feedback, even, you know, because this is something that is going on for this month. Musiani, I will hopefully give you a good answer with regard to that, but you have raised a very important question, which is really on the supply chain of batteries, which is something that we really need to discuss, especially as we increase adoption, the demand for that increases, which puts pressure on resources. So looking at how we support the countries that actually have those resources. So thanks for that question. Unfortunately, I cannot answer based on my knowledge right now. I'll have to do some research and give you an answer.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's an interesting topic that we're all thinking about. So excited to see what we learned there. Nico, I see you've got another question there. I think you can unmute yourself.
Thanks, Tom. Judith, you briefly spoke about a lack of basically regulations or standards when it comes to laboratory testing, specifically in Kenya. The situation that we have in Tanzania is we also looked at, you know, what are the standards or regulations on an EAC level. We couldn't find anything on an EAC level. However, we found a workaround. Basically, what we understood is that TBS is working together with SANAS, which is the South African accreditation system, right? And SANAS is acknowledging CNAS, which is the Chinese accreditation body. And we made sure that our laboratory that we certified all our products by are acknowledged by CNAS, and CNAS is now acknowledged by SANAS, and SANAS is acknowledged by TBS. So it's kind of a long workaround, but that actually works. The biggest issue that we saw is that still, depending on the TBS officer that's going to do the physical inspection, depending on their mood, they actually acknowledge the paper that you have, or they just say, hey, we still need to go for a laboratory test, which you then pay for, and there's never going to be, and there's no laboratory test conducted. Like, do you see something similar in Kenya? Because again, on paper, this is a legit way, because all of the different bodies are recognizing each other, recognizing their standards, and recognizing, point blank period, recognizing their standards. But what we see is the randomness of individuals not executing on these standards.
Thanks for that question, Nico. So I'll answer based on a research that we had carried out with UMI, whereby one of the challenges that was identified was the lack of battery standards. And we talked to a couple of government agencies. And what is happening right now is we do have, let me say, a working group that's working on battery standards here in Kenya. So it's not been finalized. We do have a couple of organizations and even private entities doing their own private testing. And also the Kenya Bureau of Standards is putting some work in that. But I don't have a conclusive answer on like how the standardization process is actually carried out in Kenya. What we just realized is that since the government itself doesn't have, and I can see my colleague Annika is on the call, maybe she can also feed into this, but there is no existing standard in Kenya. So we have different private entities that are just having some workarounds around that. So with the working group, they are looking at the standards that are being developed by, I want to say the country, but I'm not sure if it's correct. I'm hoping if Annika is on the call, she can answer. I think it was Thailand that is developing some battery standards, and the working group is looking at how we can actually learn and contextualize that. So that's some of the work that is being carried out. I'm wondering if anybody can comment on that.
If you like, from my end, the battery standardization, I personally don't think we need to reinvent rules. I think globally now it's very, very strict around international certification. You know, the UN 38, you can't find anyone that will ship lithium-ion batteries as shipping company without serious documentation and certification. You need Bureau Veritas. I mean, this is our experience. And yes, we need to look at making sure we don't get dumped with lots of cheap things. But I would say at the moment, it's pretty hard to ship anything that doesn't conform to the global standards. I think there's a lot of R&D that needs to be done on how batteries are used. For example, we developed our own batteries for the three-wheeler because the batteries we bought off the shelf were rubbish. So there's a lot of R&D in how we adapt and build batteries for the African market. But I don't think we should make it, we do not want European standards because we're not Europe, and we need to find a flexibility so that we can do R&D locally. But I think at the moment you cannot export anything on a ship without global certification. So if everyone just would comply with global standards, and we have UN 38 and MC 63 and whatever the others are, and we have education within import agencies and government regulatory bodies about global standards, I think that would just be enough. And then focus on the battery recycling, the battery usage, and making sure we're not leaving toxic waste. So that's my question on the batteries. I think you can go down a rabbit hole.
Sure.
I can see Annika's mic became active. Maybe she can comment.
Annika, you can unmute yourself if you'd like.
Hi, sorry, I was actually multitasking. Didn't get the question. I'm very sorry.
Oh, it was really about how companies in Kenya go around the standardization process. I thought maybe you could comment because UNEP has been doing a lot of work around standards.
Yeah, I mean, in Kenya, no, that was led by the Kenya Bureau of Standards. I've done a workshop, and the standards, the thing is, the standards in Kenya so far, they're mostly on the vehicle side, but not on the battery side. So Kenya, as far as I know, doesn't have any standards on the batteries at the moment. And that's something they've been working on. But of course, as Shanta mentioned, there are international standards that are being developed. And so the idea is usually to use these and then like put them in the right contexts and adapt them from the international level, because as Shanta also, like, most of the vehicles and batteries will come from abroad. So it's important to kind of, link it to what's being done. And then there's also, of course, the regional aspect, not looking to work with IAC or ECOWAS or SADC, right? I think that's also something that still needs to be done.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Annika. And I would just add to that quickly, you know, what happened in Kenya, from my understanding, was an adoption of ISO standards. So there's an already strong set of international standards that countries can borrow from. So if people say, oh, this is an overwhelming task to set our own standards, you know, folks typically go to the ISO standards. That's also what the people in Tanzania, the Tanzania Bureau of Standards, were planning on doing from when I last spoke with them. Calvin Tioni, feel free to unmute and pitch in.
Yes, thank you very much, Judith, and thanks so much, Tom, for your inputs. My name is Calvin Tioni. I'm an engineer here in Kenya, and I'm part of the technical committee at KEBS that is looking at the standardization process for road vehicles. We've been recently engaging in the area of batteries, battery standards, alongside those ones of for the EVs. And just to echo what Tom has talked about, the first approach would be looking at the ISO standards, because KEBS, being a member of the ISO community as a national standards body, we are adopting the relevant standards that are already applicable. Primarily, since there is no infrastructure, testing infrastructure within Kenya, within KEBS or elsewhere, we are looking at identifying the proper hierarchy of standards that will be used by KEBS to be checked, to be enforced by the pre-verification of conformity agents all around the world that KEBS has appointed. We are looking at SGS, we are looking at Bureau Veritas, we are looking at CCOC, and these inspection agencies will now have the capacity to work alongside infrastructure providers, test labs all around the world where these facilities are, to inspect on behalf of KEBS, to check whether the documentation is okay, the certifications are right, and this in a way will facilitate the smooth flow of importation, you know, just as the business process for these batteries to come to Kenya for whoever wants to ship in. So whether they are regional standards, whether they are international standards like UN ECE R38 or ISO standards, these will all be looked at based on the hierarchy of standards according to the respective regions. So this is being looked at as the best approach to facilitate, you know, the importation of these batteries to whoever who is interested, and to look at the issues at the same time. So that's kind of the approach now, and we are looking forward to see this happen. Thank you.
Great. Well, I always love to hear straight from the regulators. So thank you very much, Calvin. Shanta, did you have something to add there?
Sorry, no, I'm
Okay.
good, thank you. Sorry, I'll turn.
So actually, I had a question to pull us in a slightly different direction, maybe. I'm curious kind of about some of the adjacent policies to e-mobility. So obviously moving vehicles onto the grid, the increase in efficiency is already a good thing, removing tailpipes from the road. But what about ensuring that the grids themselves are running on renewable energy? You know, what do you see there, Judith, in terms of policy for improving grid cleanliness and other sort of adjacent policies to e-mobility?
I guess I can speak. Let me just put my charger on the computer. It's about to die. Okay, I guess I can speak mainly from the mobility angle when you look at adjacent policies. Like I mentioned, when we look at the transition to e-mobility, one thing that is very important for us is to focus mainly on mass transit. Because, you know, even if we increase motorization or vehicles on the road, even if we are to electrify all the vehicles on the road as they are right now, we don't solve the problem of congestion. You know, and that takes me back to the avoid shift framework that I mentioned at the beginning, you know, avoiding the need for travel, shifting to public transit and more sustainable modes, and then improving the energy efficiency. So for us, those are the basic frameworks that also support the transition to electric mobility, and then electric mobility is contributing to that. So for us, mainly the focus is when we look at as UN Habitat, supporting non-motorized transit, which is also pedestrianization, but also very key is cycling policies that support cycling. This is mainly around like infrastructure and the space for cyclists. And even something that we are also working on is when we look at financial incentives and policies around electric bicycles, because that's like something that we are working on with Rwanda, with the UMI and the Patel team there. Those are some of the supporting policies when we look at that. But now also when we look at public transport, yes, we are looking at mass transit, we look at public transportation of vehicles, but now even for these public transport vehicles, the buses, them transitioning to use electric, batteries, EVs, them being electric vehicles. So the underlying policy obviously is that it needs to support public transit. That is important for us. And then now we look at also how electrification can also contribute to that. So from our perspective now, looking at and also the ACI framework, those such existing policies, are also looking at contributors towards the transition to electric mobility. Then now you've also placed a very important question now when we look at grid readiness and the policies to support that. I think apart from the policies, I think we should also look at the capacity to support the transition to electric mobility, and especially in the African context as it is, when we look at if the grid can even support the needs that are there that exist at the moment. If we look at different respective governments with the grids as they are, can the grids even support the needs of the population as it is? So now when we add the pressure that the transition to electric mobility and adoption to electric mobility, that will also put more pressure on the grid. So some of the things we need to think about are, if these countries do have, like you said, policies and the capacity to look at where they're going to be generating their energy from, so that, we don't, so that it's more sustainable, more green energy that is actually being used in this transition to electric mobility. Yeah, so those are some of the things that we need to think about now. Also, another part of the supply side, where is this energy coming? Is it sustainable? Is it green? Is it also contributing to low carbon emissions, especially in the context of African governments? And if we actually do effect this transition, can the grid support the needs of the people, like the ordinary needs, but also the needs that come up with the increased adoption of EVs? Those are all policy things that needs to be think about. Some of the things that needs to be done even before policy is actually research around the energy needs of particular countries, depending on the adoption rate. And I think that is what is going to determine the different policies around that.
Great, thank you. I think it's always important to keep that in mind, to keep the broader transportation landscape in mind. So I really appreciate that. If there's no other last minute comments, I'm happy to close out here. We have at 2 o'clock a webinar on research and e-mobility, if that interests any of you. You can find the links online or in the various WhatsApp groups. Thanks again to all of our partners. And Judith, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. And we're excited for the remaining conversations.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.